Today, we start our story in Ireland before moving on to England. So sit back as we go to the 19th century. Catherine Webster was born in the year 1849 in the small rural community of Killarn in County Wexford, Ireland. Her parents were a respected and hard-working couple, and although they didn't have much money, they tried to bring up their children to be well-behaved and obedient. Catherine, however, soon started to get a reputation of being a dishonest child. She was often caught stealing and frequently disobeyed her parents. In 1864, she was sent to prison for larceny, and soon after her release, in 1867, when she was still a teenager, she decided to leave home and start a new life in England. She stole some money and purchased a boat ticket and sailed to Liverpool. This was an exciting time for the young Catherine, as Liverpool was very different to the rural surroundings that she had been used to. Life was tough for a poor teenage girl in the Victorian era, but Catherine's impoverished upbringing had made her a strong, resilient girl, and although she didn't prosper, she was able to keep herself. She was not, however, able to keep herself out of trouble, and in 1868 she was caught stealing and sent to prison for 4 years. On her release from prison in 1872, Catherine made the decision to go to London, as she knew there were better opportunities of employment in the capital. It did not take long before she found domestic work in Wandsworth, but after a few months she left and found her way to the London borough of Hammersmith, where she met Henry and Anne Porter. She would go with Mrs. Porter to wash clothes and do domestic work. Eventually she managed to find a position as a housekeeper and moved to Notting Hill to work for Captain Woolbest. While she was in his employment, she met a man named Strong. Catherine went to live with him, and although he could provide for her, his method of making money was not altogether legal. It did not take long for Catherine to fall pregnant, and on the 19th of April, 1874, she gave birth to a baby boy. Soon after giving birth, Mr. Strong left her, and Catherine was left to support herself and her child. She again resorted to her old ways and started stealing. She was caught and tried, and on the 14th of April 1875, she was sentenced to 18 months in prison. Soon after her release, she was in trouble with the law again, and on the 18th of January 1877, she was sentenced to another 12 months in prison. Life was very hard for Catherine. The Victorian period saw London transformed into one of the world's largest cities, and despite its wealth, London was a place of immense poverty, with many Londoners living in cramped and dreary accommodation. While she was in prison, Catherine left her son in the care of her friend named Sarah Creese, whom she had met while working as a domestic in one of the city's elegant houses. In January 1879, Catherine moved to the affluent residential district of Richmond, a very fashionable and sought-after location, situated next to the River Thames. Her friend Sarah Creese had been taken ill, so it was agreed that Catherine would be her temporary replacement at one of the large Richmond houses. The lady of the house was very friendly with another local resident named Julia Thomas, and was aware that she required a housemaid, so recommended Catherine. Mrs. Thomas lived at 2 Mayfield Cottages, Park Road, Richmond. She had twice been widowed and now lived alone. Neighbours questioned why she needed a housekeeper, but she considered that employing one would give her a higher social status, and with the money she was left following the deaths of her husbands, she had the financial means to employ one. She thought that a housekeeper would mean that she would be able to visit and entertain her friends more frequently, and it would also be companionship for herself. The relationship between the two soon started to go downhill. Mrs. Thomas was known to be a nice lady. She was in her mid-50s and had previously worked as a schoolteacher, but she was a little obsessive with cleanliness, and after Catherine had finished cleaning, she would go round inspecting her work and pointing out everything that she was dissatisfied with. On her nights off, Catherine would often go to the local pub and return home late and usually drunk. This would upset Mrs. Thomas, as she was a small, mild-mannered lady and her housekeeper was a young, strong and temperamental person. As these visits to the pub became more frequent, Mrs. Thomas started to become a little afraid of her maid. She confided in her friends and told them about her maid's unpredictable behaviour. They all agreed that she should dismiss her and look for a new housekeeper. After being in her position for 1 month, Mrs. Thomas told Catherine that she would be dispensing of her services. They agreed that her last day of service would be the 28th of February, 1879. But Catherine was unable to find another position or place to live, so persuaded her mistress to let her stay a couple more days until March the 2nd. The 2nd of March 1879 was a Sunday, and Mrs. Thomas always went to the evening church service. This was the day that Catherine was supposed to be leaving the house, but instead of packing her belongings, she went to the pub. When she returned, Mrs. Thomas was very angry with her, and they had a heated argument. Annoyed and frustrated with her maid, Mrs. Thomas went to church. She didn't say much to the people who attended the evening service, and some of her friends noticed that she seemed agitated. But after the service she returned home, expecting that her housekeeper would have calmed down and would be ready to vacate her property. She went straight upstairs to her bedroom as she wanted to change. As she was removing her hat, Catherine followed her into her room, and the argument started again. Catherine had not found another position and was extremely anxious about the circumstances she had found herself in. Then, suddenly, as the shouting continued, Catherine struck Mrs. Thomas in the head with the handle of an axe. Mrs. Thomas managed to get to the top of the stairs before Catherine, now filled with rage, pushed her mistress down the stairs. She then rushed down and struck one more fatal blow onto Mrs. Thomas. She looked closely at her body, but Mrs. Thomas was dead. Now Catherine started to panic. She had spent enough time in prison to know what her fate would be. She had killed her mistress. Catherine thought for a moment and then hatched up a plan. She knew that her mistress was known to frequently go away to the continent, often leaving without letting her friends or relatives know of her whereabouts for weeks or months at a time. So all Catherine needed to do was get rid of the evidence and say that her mistress had gone away. She had to dispose of the body, but could not chance it getting found, so came up with something quite bizarre. She started to cut up Mrs. Thomas's body and boil the body parts in the laundry copper, which was usually used to wash clothes. After she had done this, she started to clean up the mess. All of this was exhausting work, so Catherine went to the pub for a drink and a rest, and then she returned to the house to sleep. The next day she made up a fire in the kitchen and put in her victim's bones. She then carefully packed the cut body parts into boxes and cloth bags lined with thick brown paper. When she had finished, she was left with Mrs. Thomas's head and foot, so she went out and threw the foot onto a rubbish heap in nearby Twickenham and put the head in a bag. On the 4th of March, Catherine went to see her friends, the Porters in Hammersmith. She put on some of Mrs. Thomas's clothes and jewellery. She also took a bag of body parts. She told the Porters that in the 6 years since she had last seen them, she had married, had a child, and been widowed, but had had the good fortune of inheriting a house in Richmond. She invited Mr. Porter and his son Robert to the pub, and while crossing a bridge, dropped a bag into the River Thames. She already dropped a few bags into the river, but needed to get rid of a chest with her victim's remains, so asked Robert Porter if he could help her carry a crate to the station. Of course, he obliged, and returned with Catherine to the house to help her transport it to the station, which would mean crossing the river again. When they were halfway over Richmond Bridge, she told the lad to leave the crate and that she would catch him up in a few minutes. Then, Catherine calmly pushed the crate into the River Thames. Her plan to get rid of the body was working. However, the following day, the mysterious crate was discovered, washed up near Barnes Bridge by a man named Henry Wheatley. He opened it and was astonished to find mutilated body parts. He reported his discovery to the police, Around the same time the foot was found in Twickenham, the police examined their evidence and concluded that the foot and the remains belonged to the same person. They did not have a head, so there was no way of identifying the body. The newspapers dubbed the unexplained murder as the Barnes Mystery. Instead of trying to leave Richmond, Catherine strangely continued to try and make more money from the woman she had so brutally murdered. She visited tradesmen and pawnbrokers, doing her best to sell Mrs. Thomas's possessions and furniture. She even continued to wear her victims' dresses. When some men appeared at the cottage to collect the furniture, the next-door neighbour, Miss Ives, grew suspicious. She had not seen Mrs. Thomas for a while, and recognised that Catherine was often wearing her clothes. She asked the removal men, who had asked for the furniture to be removed. When they replied, "Mrs. Thomas," and pointed to Catherine, Catherine knew that she would soon be discovered. She did not get on with Miss Ives, and she was certain that she would report her suspicions to the police, so Catherine collected her son and caught a train to Liverpool. Then she returned to Ireland. The authorities went to the cottage and made a grim discovery. They found an axe, and they also found fragments of charred bones in the kitchen fire. They saw that the laundry copper had a large ring of fat around its edge. The newspapers soon started reporting the story, and they interviewed local people who claimed that Catherine had been selling what they believed was dripping, but was actually the boiled remains of their neighbour. The police were soon able to track their suspect down, as she had left her home address in Ireland on a letter in the house. So police contacted their Irish counterparts, and Catherine was arrested on the 28th of March at her uncle's farm in Killaan. At the time of her arrest, she was still wearing Mrs. Thomas's clothes and jewellery. After being told about the crime with which his niece had been charged, Catherine's uncle refused to look after her son, and the authorities sent him to the local workhouse. Catherine was then escorted back to London and charged with murder. The trial started on the 2nd of July 1879 at the Old Bailey in London. News of the grisly event that had happened 4 months before in Richmond had spread throughout the country, and there was huge public interest in the case. Catherine Webster had become so notorious that even the Crown Prince of Sweden attended the trial. People also made their way to the cottage in Richmond to see where the murder took place. The trial seemed an open and shut case. Madame Tussauds had already started producing a waxwork of Catherine for their Chamber of Horrors before the trial had even started. The newspapers portrayed her as a violent woman who spent far too much time drinking in the pub. The whole country thought she was guilty. But Catherine pleaded not guilty. The defence told the court that all the evidence was circumstantial. No one had seen her commit the crime or dispose of the body, and the head had never been found, so no one could be certain that the body was that of Mrs. Thomas. They suggested that others could have been responsible, and Catherine tried to pin the blame on Mr. Church the publican and Mr. Porter, her ex-neighbour from Hammersmith. One crucial witness for the prosecution was a hatmaker named Maria Durden, who told the court that Catherine had visited her shop a week before the murder and had said that she was going to Birmingham to sell some property, jewellery and a house that her aunt had left her. This suggested to the court that the murder had been premeditated. The trial lasted for 6 days, and when the jury returned, they found the defendant, Catherine Webster, guilty. Before sentencing, however, she announced to the court that she was pregnant. She was sent to be examined by matrons, who later returned to inform the court that she was not pregnant, and Catherine was sentenced to hang. Still proclaiming her innocence, her defence team submitted an appeal against the death penalty to the Home Secretary, but the appeal was dismissed. On the eve of her execution, Catherine confessed her guilt and gave a detailed account of her actions during and after the murder. Finally, having confessed her sins, Catherine Webster was hanged at Wandsworth Prison on July the 29th, 1879. The mystery surrounding Mrs. Thomas's head was not resolved, and it was presumed that Catherine had disposed of it in the River Thames. 131 years later, on the 22nd of October 2010, workmen carrying out excavation work between the pub Catherine used to visit and the cottage where she committed her grisly crime found a dark, circular object, which on inspection turned out to be a woman's skull. It was found on what, in 1879, would have been the pub stables, and was on top of Victorian tiles. No DNA was available, as Mrs. Thomas had no known relatives, but the skull had fracture marks consistent with being thrown down the stairs, and it was found to have low collagen levels consistent with being boiled. It is believed to be the skull of Mrs. Julia Thomas. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As per usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I will see you in the next brief case.